Next call here. Now, this is a non-hand call, I believe. We're going to go here to Mr. Nick. Hello, Nick. How you doing?
Hey Bart, can you hear me all right?
I can, Nick. Now, what's interesting about this is that I got an email, Nick, from a different guy at Lucky Chances, because I believe you're going to talk about Lucky Chances, right? Is that right?
Right.
I got an email from a different guy at Lucky Chances with some similar types of, this is a bankroll question, so I'm going to incorporate some of the stuff that he asked, because his name was AB, so we'll incorporate it. But why don't you tell us what your question was in the email?
Yeah, playing up in Northern California, mostly at Lucky Chances, just south of San Francisco, but
Yep.
also at the Oaks Card Room and California Grand Casino in the East Bay. Kind of just calling because I've played very recreationally at the 1-3 level. Kind of have between 300 and 400 hours played.
Okay.
Kind of want to take my game up a level through studying. And I know you've mentioned how the rate considerations in California make the games almost unbeatable at the 1-3 level,
Right.
and how it's really a race to the $5 blind level. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on, if I do move up, kind of how much preparation with studying and how much bankroll management I should kind of set aside to properly jump into one of these games.
Well, I can answer your first question right off the bat. Zero in terms of moving up to a $5 blind level. Now, I will caveat that by saying that things hop into my mind like Hollywood Park, where it's like a $500 cap. Sometimes there are rooms in California where the $5 blind game is the biggest game in the room. That's different. But a lot of these LA games with $5 blinds, which are like 500 max, I mean, you should just be instantly playing those. But one of the things, Nick, I remember from your email though too, is like you have a job, right? Like I think you remember, I think you said you didn't want to necessarily dip into non-poker money, but it's not like you're playing professionally, right?
Right now, not professionally at all. I'm definitely not going to be spending,
Right.
a lot of hours per week. Kind of my situation. So I'm a tax accountant. So the work is very seasonal. Kind of in the summer and winter times, it's
Yep.
very not very busy. So those are the times where I feel like I can go and play poker kind of more often. And if I start to do that, I kind of do want to be profitable. I don't just want to
Sure.
go and I don't want to play just to have fun, right?
No, absolutely. And by the way, seasonal meaning like February 6th, I'm sure you're about to be very, very busy. But
Right.
this is a very common, you're in a very common sort of question. Like you want to be you want to be a part-time profitable player. I think
That's right.
I think that is probably like 80 or 90% of my subscriber base. Maybe a little bit
Mhm.
less. We do have a bunch of people that are playing full time. But here's the thing about that gives you such an advantage, because you're not grinding it out for a living where you have a catastrophic event. If you have a risk of ruin, you have to be so conservative with your bankroll if you're playing full time, where if you have a risk of ruin, which means you go down to zero, you can't play anymore, you can't make any, you don't have the tools to earn profit. You have to be much, much more conservative with your bankroll than a guy that's in your situation. And I think people that are in your situation is a lot more common than somebody that's back against the wall, like risk of ruin. So you can be more aggressive with your bankroll. And one of the most important things, and this is specifically for you California guys, because obviously you emailed me in, Nick, about this, the way that the game is set up and the rake commission, which is a flat drop, which a lot of people don't understand what that means. Most, if not all, I don't know how it is in Northern California, of the money that they take from the pot is taken on the flop, no matter how big the pot is. So instead of a rake, which is a percentage up to an amount, so if you're playing a 1-2 game or a 1-3 game and it's 10% up to $4 or $5, and the pot's only $10, they only take $1. In California, they're going to take the entire drop, which can be up to $6 on the flop with one for the bad beat jackpot. Some places will take an extra dollar on turn and on river, somewhere up at 7 or 8, no matter how large the pot is. So when you play that scenario out, they are taking such a huge chunk of the overall money from small stakes games in a flat drop type of scenario that they become almost unbeatable. And what I mean by almost unbeatable and unplayable is that, sure, maybe you can squeak out some dollars per hour. Maybe like $10 to $15 per hour. By the way, these are not deep stack games. They're not Texas games. A 1-3 game is going to be probably at the most a 300 cap. That's on the high end. They have 2-5, 200 cap games in LA. So when you play all that out, you are going to be squeaking out dollars. You can't really build a bankroll. And I think a secondary consideration why you don't want to play in those games is because if you were to play those games for the most profitability, you actually can develop some bad habits, because playing in very, very restricted buy-in games sometimes will force you to play backwards because you never really have to build the pot up. So you probably are supposed to be constantly slow playing. I'll tell you another thing too. We're not robots. And to play in those games the most profitable, you probably should play less than 10% of your hands. You are incentivized to not be involved in small pots in any fashion because it's a flat drop, not a percentage that comes out of the pot. So when you look at that, like, that's not fun for me to sit there and play less than 10% of my hands. I always say, hey, for guys that might be transitioning to live poker, that want to get a feel for live poker, that maybe you've played online, maybe you play a couple of weeks at that level just to get a feel of the chips. You buy in for the chips, you get, get accustomed to the shenanigans that go on in live poker. But you should be getting up to the $5 blind level as quickly as possible. Now, when people say, well, I don't have bankroll issues and things like that, if you have a job, the bankroll issues really aren't that much of a consideration for the things that I talked about. The other thing too is that if you're playing a 1-3 game where you typically buy in for 300, go to the 5-5 game and buy, that's either a 500 cap or 1,000 cap, and buy in for 300. You can play the shorter stack so profitable. One of the most profitable spots in No Limit Hold'em is a profitable short stack player. They're very, very few and far between because most good players are more profitable if they're deep stack. But if you get yourself into a loose, splashy, small stakes game where people are typically opening to 5 or 6x at the $5 blind level and you buy in for 300, you can print in that game. Absolutely print, because guys aren't supposed to call your raises. You can do a lot of 3-bet shoving, and you're going to have to play tight in the beginning. But one of the things that I always tell people is just go and sit in the game. Buy in for what you're comfortable with. If you want to min buy, that's fine. You will quickly figure out that the skill level of these players at the $5 blind level are not anything like spectacular. They're almost as bad as the guys at the short stack in those smaller games. The other thing about those smaller games that's super, super annoying is the fact that I think they have a disproportionate amount of short stacks. Like, you'll actually find way more people who are super short, which makes it even more unplayable, even more unprofitable,
It's frustrating because, almost every time I sit down at one of these tables, right, I buy in for 300, which is usually the max. But there's always, if we're playing 9-handed, there's always at least 4 to 5, people who just sit there and buy in for $100 over and over. So it's like half the stacks are $100, and then I'm usually there with like the second biggest stack, which is like $300.
And this is in the 1-2-3 game, is that right?
It's a 1-2-2.
So what's the next game up that you can move up to at Oaks or at Lucky Chances?
It's at Lucky Chances, I believe it's 3-5, and I think the cap is $1,000.
Okay.
But at a lot of the Northern California poker rooms and casinos, it kind of depends on the dealer whether they want to enforce the cap or not.
Okay.
Which is kind of weird, but
it sounds to me like this $5 blind game might be the largest consistent game that goes at the Oaks and Lucky Chances. Like, there's no game in the middle.
I think so. Yes, there's no game in the middle. I don't know if there's a 5-10. or if the five
Right.
ten only runs on certain days, or what the deal
Right.
is with that. But
That is slightly different than what I'm talking about, because you might see some decent players if it's the largest game in the room. One of the best things that you could possibly do is when you're first starting to hop in for, get a little bit of confidence, is wait until 510 is running and then go and play in that game, because the game will be softer. The game will definitely be softer for sure. But yeah, man, you got to do the math out. It's just like the playing in those small games with that drop structure is really kind of a waste of time. I mean, I think for a guy like you who's got supplementary income, go and buy in for what you buy in for in your smaller game, in that $5 blind game, to actually gain some confidence and things like that. The questions that I got from another subscriber, funny enough, from Lucky Chance, this guy AB said he's not bankrolled for a 200 big blind buy-in at 3-5 games. So is it better to buy in for 100 big blinds at 3-5 or 150 to 200 big blinds at the 2-3 game? Well, Nick, can you answer that question for him from based upon what I just said?
well, it sounds like going at the $5 blind level is definitely the move.
At 100 big blinds, absolutely. That
Right.
you do not need to buy in for 200. And again, the shorter that you are, I think the more of an advantage that you have, and then you will gain the confidence. And then when you start getting some wins, you can start to know the player pool a little bit more, right? Maybe you buy in deeper when the players are bad, when you have position on certain guys, when there aren't any good players that are going to give you a little bit of a headache. This second question is, what are your thoughts on most hands at a 3-5 table that have a $10 straddle on them? Again, this is a situation where you might find yourself in this game that you've moved up to that might be the largest in your room, and now all of a sudden they're doing a mandatory straddle. So now it's up to $10. And you're like, oh my God, this game's, so big, so big. Again, the shorter that you are with the blind in these splashy games, the more of an advantage that you have. Now, to answer your first question, now that I've thought about that, the type of studying that I would want to do for a guy like you who was already a member of Crush Live Poker might actually be to look at the short stack stuff. Almost actually look at it like because I think a lot of cash game players don't pay attention to that if they don't play tournaments, but it might behoove you to actually look. It's not going to be 100 hours of studying, but it's actually looking at certain situations and certain hands where pre-flop squeezing is profitable, given a lot of dead money that's out there. That's not something that I look at really, unless I'm about to play at the World Series, where it's slightly different, because it never really comes into play for me. But for somebody like you, it might in the beginning,
Right.
So
right, definitely.
I hope that answered your question. I hope you hop in there as soon as possible. And good luck to you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the time, Bart.
You got it.